Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm going to be talking about the debut album from the Avalanches, Since I Left You. The Avalanches are a plunderphonics band currently consisting of Robbie Chater, Tony DeBlasi, and James De La Cruz. And back when this album came out, also Darren Seltman, Dexter Fabe, and Gordon McQuilton. May have butchered one or more of those names. Plunderphonics, as I've come to realize, is a genre that maybe not everybody considers to be electronic. I admit the overall sound of many plunderphonic albums isn't exactly electronic, this album here for example, but I've always found the practice of taking lots of other people's work and repurposing it into your own compositions to certainly be electronic. I mean, samplers and turntables are electronic instruments used by DJs and producers, aren't they? It's the kind of genre where you can have lots of old-sounding organic textures in an album produced and composed entirely by one person. I mean, just look at DJ Shadow. I mean, granted, the Avalanches were a 6-person outfit at the time, but the point still stands. If plunderphonics doesn't count as electronic, that means I don't get the chance to talk about a ton of albums and artists that I love. Like this one. I kinda wanted to talk about this album before the Avalanches' second album, Wildflower, came out, but they pulled a fast one on me and released it on Apple Music a week early, so yeah. I did hear Wildflower, but the version I heard sounded like crap, well, audio quality-wise, not musically, so I'm holding out for a higher quality version to listen to before I actually review it. But in the meantime, let's talk about Since I Left You. It should come as no surprise that this is one of my favorite albums of all time. It's the kind of album that almost merits no discussion because it's just that well made. It's that well received. It's that special to me personally. It's very easy accessible, like Air's Moon Safari, but with far more depth. The kind of album that I've listened to for years and can still find new insights. I've heard that it's loosely based around a concept of going on a cruise to forget about a recently ended relationship. And while there are definitely parts of this album that decidedly do not fit this concept, see Frontier Psychiatrist, I also heard a recent interview from the Avalanches saying that what they cared about most was getting the emotions across. Not really telling a coherent story or making people think a certain way about the album. That being said, I still imagine this entire album as like some kind of elaborate stage show or whatever taking place on a cruise ship. Maybe it's because there's also some clear inspiration from the Beach Boys and their awesome harmonies. By the way, yes, I also used to be a big Beach Boys fan as a kid. You can definitely see it on the opening title track, Since I Left You. Everything seems totally carefree and happy. You hear somebody tell you, have a drink, have a good time, welcome to paradise, and your journey begins. This song is of course super catchy, and you'll be singing along with it on first listen. Stay Another Season is pretty much part 2 of the opening track, although it's a little more uncertain. There's some sound effects like police sirens and horse neighing, the latter of which appears in a lot of different tracks actually. But still, this album is a great example of why I love continuous mixes. Every track on this album seamlessly transitions into the next. While songs like Stay Another Season seem to be purely there for transitional purposes, you might not even notice that the previous song had ended on first listen. After all, the main hook is still being repeated throughout this song. But it does still have its own identity thanks to the noticeable mood shift. Even all the little interludes I think help add to the overall album experience. Like Avalanche Rock, which doesn't even last 30 seconds, but still provides an easily memorable hook. Diners Only, which serves directly as a transition from the 2 songs surrounding it, but does still sound like it takes place on some kind of on-deck restaurant. Pablo's Cruise, which adds a very solitary and atmospheric touch. And Little Journey, which sounds like a bunch of quick sidetracks, but each little moment remains memorable. Like the sample at the beginning that sounds like somebody involuntarily being pushed into a pool. I suppose this album does have its weaker moments that never really did much for me, but looking into it, I can't say any of them are, like, removable in any way. For instance, 2 songs that I never found to be outstanding were Ito and Summer's Crane. The former, like, almost kinda suffers from having come right after a far more memorable and in-your-face track and kinda being subdued and being less memorable as a result. but the emotion is still there. I believe the song gets its name from an old member of the band that some of the members of the Avalanches formed before forming the Avalanches, called Alarm 115. The member in question, Manabu Ito, was the drummer, but he was deported from Australia, so I suppose this song is their little tribute to him. Listening to this song out of context, there's nothing particularly wrong with it, and there are a lot of interesting twists and turns throughout it. It just doesn't stand out as much as some of the others. Summer's Crane doesn't have any interesting story behind it, like Ito, but it does have that kind of end of a romance movie feel to it. Again, not a huge standout, but in my opinion, the album's real weakest point is Radio. This song feels really simplistic and repetitive to me, and while it has a great groove to it that I still look forward to, it feels awfully threadbare and uninteresting compared to other tracks on here. I did hear an alternate version of this song which had some other samples that weren't cleared in the final version, and really the only difference was a longer intro along the lines of Frontier Psychiatrist's intro. While it does not address my biggest issues with the song as a whole, yes, that intro does in fact improve the song and give it a little more extra punch and humor. But yeah, I think the song's a little too repetitive for its own good. But now that we're through all the less memorable stuff, let's get back to talking about my favorites. 2 Hearts and 3/4 Time is not as romantic as you'd think, starting with samples of somebody saying, money, 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 but turning into a catchy nonsense tune that's easy to hum along with. Flight Tonight admittedly isn't one of my favorites, but I can't think of anything to criticize it for. It's got a catchy, repetitive spoken word sample as the hook, and it's actually pretty hip-hop oriented with some rapping near the end too. But it transitions into the far more engaging, to me at least, Close to You, which starts out with a pretty melody and has a lot of foot tapping moments, but it slowly builds up to this awesome, huge orchestral part near the end. The song gets you headbanging the whole time. A Different Feeling is kinda like Close to You in reverse, starting out really intense and headbang worthy, but slowly getting mellower as time goes on. Then we get another set of contrasts in Electricity and Tonight, the former being mostly really intense with lots of samples telling you to rock out, and the latter being much mellower and laid back. Both are unsurprisingly really catchy, but there's very little on this album that isn't catchy anyways. Probably the most striking moment on this album is of course the much mentioned Frontier Psychiatrist. I already mentioned how it seems to directly contrast the overall feel of the rest of the album, but that doesn't make it any less fun to listen to. It seems totally random and themed after somebody going insane, but there is something insanely catchy about it, and how easy it is to memorize how those samples go. You only need to hear the song once or twice, and soon you'll be talking to yourself about how that boy needs therapy. It's psychosomatic, that boy needs therapy. You're psychosomatic, that boy needs therapy. Lie down on the couch, what does that mean? You're unnatural, you're crazy in the coconut, what does that mean? That boy needs therapy. I'm gonna kill you, that boy needs therapy. Actually, I should stop before I just recite the whole song, so I think I've gotten my point across, though. That pretty much leaves the ending to talk about. Live at Dominoes is more or less the climax of the album, and is the most fast-paced and pumped-up song on the whole album. While it's not as maddeningly catchy as Frontier Psychiatrist, it's just as randomly put together, and just as much of a journey to get through. You think it's about to end several times, but it's only about to get even more intense. You don't know where it's going, but you're just along for the ride, and it's one heck of a ride indeed. But all of it ends with Extra Kings, which is basically the more interesting and memorable version of Summer's Crane. It even starts with the same French-speaking sample, but goes off on a few more tangents with some elevator music sounding sections, some big orchestral sounds, and finally ending with another sample that recalls the name of the album and brings everything full circle. Overall, this really is the kind of album that's I wouldn't go so far as to call any album perfect, but it's almost too near flawless to discuss. Well, obviously it's not 100% perfect, but still. The feelings of nostalgia come pre-packaged with all the samples and vinyl crackling to make it sound older and more timeless. I can listen to it in the background and just let the emotion carry me away and let that hour shoot by almost immediately. Or I could listen to it in depth and continue to pick up on little twists and sidetracks that I missed before. I thought long and hard about whether any of the weaker moments I mentioned actually take away from my enjoyment of this album in any way. And to be honest, they really don't. I can't think of anything about this album that I don't like. Even Radio's perfectly fine out of context, though I don't think I'd want to listen to it out of context. I could count on one hand how many albums I'd be willing to give the rating I'm about to give this one. In fact, I can only think of 2 others off the top of my head, and this one I think just barely meets this threshold. I wasn't even planning on giving this rating to this album before I started reviewing it, but I thought long and hard about it, and honestly, after taking into account my enjoyment of every individual track, and how everything comes together as one cohesive whole, I'm totally convinced that the Avalanches Since I Left You deserves a 10 out of 10. And while Wildflower Spoilers does not top this, re-listening to this really only convinced me that the world needs more of the Avalanches, and I can't imagine anything but good things being added to the world by them making more music, even if they never hit the same highs as these. If you haven't heard this album already, go check it out immediately. Favorite track, Since I Left You, Stay Another Season, 2 Hearts and 3 for Time, Close to You, A Different Feeling, Electricity, Tonight, Frontier Psychiatrist, Live at Dominoes, Extra Kings, Least Favorite Track, Radio. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time!